Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. Mining Weekly editor Martin Creamer is in the studio to tell us about the US's Dodd-Frank Act, which US Assistant Secretary of State for Economic, Energy and Business Affairs, Jose Fernandez, says is not intended to hurt ethical African gold miners. Welcome to the show, Martin.
Thanks, Shannon.
What is the Dodd-Frank Act and what does it hope to achieve?
Yeah, this was enacted by President Barack Obama last year. And it gets its name from two US politicians. The one guy's name, and I better just check that, is Barney Frank, and the other one is Chris Dodd. And it's aimed at full transparency in all American transactions, and it's born out of the meltdown. We had this terrible economic meltdown, and there was too much opacity within the financial services area, and this let the economy of the US down quite badly. We had the global meltdown, and then they created this Dodd-Frank Act to make sure that there's transparency across the board, including, in metals and minerals that come in from conflict areas. They want to know about it. So one of the areas in question is the Democratic Republic's eastern North Kivu area, where quite a few people are gold mining. We've got South Africa's biggest gold miner, AngloGold Ashanti, doing quite a bit of exploring there. And we've also got Mark Bristow, who's a South African down the road here. We know he is from Randgold Resources, and he's got Kibali there, and he's got a partnership with AngloGold Ashanti. So it's a good gold area. But what is happening with this is that there are a lot of unintended consequences with this act. And they started surfacing this week when the Assistant US Secretary was in town, Jose Fernandez, quite an impressive person. And but there was a sort of a lament at question time from a South African representing AngloGold Ashanti saying, this is an unintended consequence, but what is happening is that three of the biggest electronics manufacturers in the United States, and we know them quite well, Apple and Intel and Motorola, have decided that they won't use African gold at all in their electronic manufacturing, because they don't want to become embroiled in the red tape involved with this act. Because what has happened is there's a section of the act which imposes a duty on the US Securities and Exchange, SEC, to actually make sure that all listed companies disclose and maybe even have special audits to see where they're getting their metals and minerals from. And they name gold particularly, and other metals and minerals that are strategic, coming out of conflict areas.
So it's kind of a Kimberley process, but for gold and other minerals.
It's like a throwback to the Kimberley process, where we saw the Kimberley process being imposed to try and stop warlords in various parts of Africa fueling and funding their warring factions with revenue from precious minerals. In that case, it was diamonds. And those are so portable and so easy to get out of countries. They've been fueling a lot of wars going right back to the days of Angola. And the developed world said, no, enough is enough. And so they brought in that Kimberley process, which has worked quite well. Dodd-Frank wants to do the same thing with conflict minerals. And they specifically named the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you can't blame them, because some of the atrocities coming out of there really taint that gold. And although we're talking about relatively small quantities being used by the electronics industry, there is a fear by bona fide, ethical South African miners that, they'll be mining in the DRC and they'll be tarred with this brush, that their gold is tainted. And can you imagine if that happens in the jewelry industry? Already you can see a lot of jewelry associations starting to lobby, saying we don't want tainted gold. And they're starting to put pressure on the US SEC, saying, don't delay with these regulations. We want them through now. So people don't want to wear tainted gold. They feel that that's something that they should not do. And the backfiring of this act, which was well-intentioned, is now beginning to hurt, or threatening to hurt, lawful miners.
Now, on that note, what happens to these firms if they are negatively impacted by this situation?
Well, the biggest impact is that people won't use their gold. They will also the exact punishment that they will receive, I'm not sure, but the biggest punishment will be that their gold cannot be put into the market in the same way as you had these diamonds that were blood diamonds. They weren't allowed to circulate, and that is going to hurt the DRC quite badly. Legitimate miners in the DRC will be hurt, but also the DRC itself, because you've got legitimate people there saying, we want this investment, we want this foreign investment, this is what is going to take us out of our warring past, we need it. But miners, by the same token, are saying, I can't take all the red tape that's going to come out of this. I'd rather mine in another area. So, there's a fear that they would withdraw. But I think we had sympathy from the visiting Assistant Secretary of State, who understands the situation, and is saying, we can't be an ostrich to the warring factions, but we can also not be an ostrich and keep our head in the sand to any negative impact this has on the region and on ethical gold miners. So we want those ethical gold miners there. He expressed the confidence, that there will be compliance, that those who believe in lawfulness, those miners who are ethical, they will be all right. He used the word all right. But he did have the rider that if we find that isn't the case, we'll have to rethink this. So I think they're in fairly safe hands. It's good that the issue's been raised quite early. The State Department, I'm told, is really up to speed on this. So I'm sure that they'll watch it very closely. But what the area of the United States that is not in a comfort zone on all this is what I said, the SEC. That SEC, which is the US Securities and Exchange Commission. They're not in a comfort zone. So, and they're the ones that have got to actually marshal this and make sure all the listed companies comply. So I think that they probably need some help, to get this through in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences, the sort of consequences that it's having now, where massive big electronics companies, Apple, Intel, Motorola, say we will not use African gold. They don't even say DRC gold. They say we will not use African gold because they don't want to fill in these reams of documents, and they don't want to have to be scrutinized and audited. They would rather say, look, give us Canadian gold or give us Australian gold. In that way they avoid this burden, and that is bad for Africa.
Now, how can companies that actually are mining legitimately prove their legitimacy?
Well, I think they're going to have to go through due process. There's also, besides the United States and the Dodd-Frank Act, there's also the Club of Rich Countries. We call them the OECD countries. They are looking at this very carefully as well, because they want a balance. They want to create a balance. And they are setting guidelines. They're setting guidelines of how mines should comply and therefore escape any hardship. And the legitimate miners are keen to prove their bona fides, and they're ready to prove their bona fides. They can show you how they mine their gold, that they don't actually fuel any war and they don't fund any war, and they will be happy to let people transparently view all that. So they're keen to do that. And the OECD countries are also, they've already got support from 40 people that say, look, we will comply with your guidelines to make sure that we don't fuel any conflict. But I think the OECD has also got its eye on a few suspects, and they may make an example of those suspects in order to get everybody into line. But the Assistant Secretary of State, Jose Fernandez, also referred to the OECD guidelines, and from which people took some heart that he was aware of these, and he feels that there will be compliance, there will be due process, that the good guys won't be hurt, and that the bad guys will.
Now, one final question. You've mentioned that these large corporations, some of them are totally excluding African gold. That also then includes South African gold, because we're part of the continent.
Exactly. I don't think Americans distinguish South Africa from Africa. They see South Africa as Africa. We, of course, we often say African gold as if it's not our gold, but it is. I mean, they're going to paint the whole continent with the same brush,
Yes.
and that's the danger. And as I say, although their quantities are relatively small now, you know, that principle could spread, particularly to the jewelry industry, and that would be very hard on African gold miners, many of whom are, you know, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. They have the highest ethical standards. And the World Gold Council is also imminently going to come out with some guidelines, which I'm sure all the members of the World Gold Council will subscribe to. So those are the top level gold miners. I think they'll overcome this one.
Well, we wait and see. Thank you very much, Martin.
Great pleasure, Shannon.
That's the show for today. Join us again next time for more news and insight into what's happening in the mining world.